makes most women start a business? Is it passion, money, or freedom? Welcome to Female Founders, the podcast that takes you behind the scene with women who are founders and CEOs to help you start and scale a successful business of your own. I am your host, Nagelia de Ravin. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Female Founders. In this episode, I will be having a conversation with Patty Lindstrom. In the early mid-90s, Patty took a leap of faith and started her own company, Creative Logic Inc. She is also the founder of Living the Brand Academy and Innovation Foundry. Good morning, Patty. Can you tell us about your background and what led you to starting Creative Logic Inc. and also Living the Brand Academy?
Okay. Good morning. And sure, I guess I'll begin by sharing that as a very young person growing up, I was always highly creative and I've always, I guess, what you'd call was an out-of-the-box thinker. I always have challenged status quo. I did my undergraduate degree in visual communication and design and initially started in industry as an art director and creative director first for a newspaper and a major manufacturer, and then in more agency and marketing firm environments. And my last two roles, prior to going on my own, that has been nearly, believe it or not, 30 years ago. My last two roles were I took a role as new business development director for a firm that mainly focused on the publishing industry that was interested in seeking entry into commercial or agency work. And then I took on a creative director role for a funded startup. And these two roles were very strategic for me, meaning, the new business development role, I'd always been somebody who was good with, building relationships and selling. I mean, even my parents in my neighborhood, people in my neighborhood, I had a paper route growing up. My parents always said that neighborhood people and, the people on my route were like, she's always selling something. So, I was somebody who knew how to sell, but I wanted to know that I could sell myself and sell new business into an organization. And that particular organization happened to be also a beta test site for a lot of the newest technology. So it was kind of twofold to keep on the front end of what was going on with technology and software, even clear back then, and learn to sell and then be part of a funded startup. Okay, now mind you, that many years ago, there were not very many, if any, female entrepreneurs in the startup scene. Okay, so very often I was the only female at the table, many times with men, predominantly 20 plus years my age, which was a pro and a con. The con was the obvious, the challenges women have always, worked to overcome and earn their right at the table. But the pro were because, I really always said somewhat the attitude of I didn't know what I couldn't do, and nobody was going to tell me because I was my own, biggest challenger, and so I had the opportunity to serve on a lot of boards and be invited to the table because many of those individuals that, saw my tenacity and wanted some diversity of thought and I think liked the way that I thought. So I started Creative Logic, back in the early to mid 90s. And initially we were focused on corporate image, brand and full service marketing. And then that transitioned as digital grew and scaled, we moved with that. And then going back at least 20 years ago, we started doing And this initially started with one predominant customer and some others. We were doing work for a power company, utilities, the industry, and at the time the industry was going through deregulation and such. And, we did supported a lot of their marketing and, back then there were still printed annual reports and positioning of the executives and such from a PR standpoint. Many times they would tell me we were adding value in strategic areas that we weren't necessarily being contracted for, which made me realize, it was the natural strategic thinking. So, I got additional training in implementing corporate vision and strategic planning through the American Management Association and a week-long program out in California that was focused on, you had to be either the founder or leading a division of a large organization. And I thought I would be exposed to both those that were implementing their own corporate vision as prospective clients, so I could look at it from that perspective, and how to do it for ourselves, in terms of, I've always been somewhat forward thinking, but, you can always learn from others' trials and tribulations. So that's really how Creative Logic came to be. And I don't know, did you ask me about the Academy or just Creative Logic at this point?
But what is all the services that Creative Logic provide itself, with that company itself?
What do they provide?
Yes, what are the services?
We write business development plans and strategies. We'll help with all the tactical execution of, omni-channel, go-to-market, all the tools, your social media, your website, your positioning strategies. We begin with the overall brand strategy, which many times people are in market with tactical solutions before they have really looked at how they want to grow and scale their brand. And this happens with large organizations and well-funded organizations as well as small. Sometimes we're not working across the entirety of help, transforming. It may be that that there's an area that's not performing well, and you have to, look at what is affecting that. Sometimes what's affecting it is the culture, sure. Or the leadership. And those are challenges, because then, it's part of why I went on to do the training I did with my PhD, is to learn about tools and resources at an organizational behavior and development component that, beyond what I was aware of, so that whether partnering with others or delivering on our own, we could help leadership teams get further with better, tools and processes.
But you also have experience working with startups. So do you also help startup right now?
We do. And in the past, going back a good number of years ago, we worked with much smaller startups, but you learn that, most often now, when I say we work with funded startups, it's because, like every, statistically, 1 of 10 startups make it. Okay. So we generally try to, get involved when there's traction and a plan for scalability. There are some tools and resources we have developed that we are working towards sort of packaging and streamlining and teaching online for startups as small as a one-person, salon to a, all types of more local organizations, which is where we started. But, like any organization with time, and it's not that we don't work with small organizations, we still do. But, more often than not, it's a little bit larger organization with, larger budgets and teams that we're helping. It's not just our team, we're supporting an internal team. However, I find, it's a lot of fun when you work with the actual entrepreneurs. Yeah. And hence my desire to get some of what we do online, to segment it so that it can be delivered differently based on who the audience is. And the price point is different depending on the audience. And that's not because simple, if you're delivering it to a larger organization, the bandwidth and depth and what is necessary is different than, delivering to a small organization starting up and growing.
It's a lot more work because you are dealing with more people as well compared if you are dealing with a startup, a one person that's, like you said, that just doing hair, that has a salon, just one. It's just that one person. But when you're dealing with a corporation that has like thousands of employees, then it's a lot more stress, a lot more work. And also your team needs to put more work into it as well. So it costs your company a lot more money, which makes a lot more sense to charge more.
Right.
So now do you find it, you find it more like big corporations need your help better than a small corporation? Like you're talking about like a company with 10 employees compared to a company that has hundreds of employees.
I think all companies need some form of support and help and that hasn't changed, historically and today. It's just, it changes with what's happening in the market and in society. Some of the changes that you're seeing now are, driven by all the digital tools and by, the, hybrid work environment, the volume of what takes place in social media that is changing, all of the other channels, and the younger audience is not in many of the places that the audiences used to be in the past. So, it's just what is different is the size of the market and what's happening in society.
Everything changed. So now let's talk a little bit more about Living the Brand Academy, which is a live and online education platform. Can you tell us more about it and also the courses that you guys offered?
Yes. So Living the Brand Academy is essentially, Creative Logic is still the holding company. It may become its own separate entity completely, but it's an extension of what we've done, over time. So in the early 2000s, we developed a curriculum and a 5-phase process and program that structurally and from a frame point standpoint is repeatable regardless of industry. The differentiators are the size of the organization, the markets they're competing in, how they take themselves to market, and it can also be non-for-profits, et cetera, and how they apply the principles. Okay. And up until the late 2000s, 2008, 10, we had only ever used this system and processes for our own clients. Mm-hmm. So we had, developed it, refined it, and interestingly, there's still very few organizations globally that teach brand strategy and the entirety of this in this manner. But I realized long before digital that, became what it is today, that it was a significant opportunity to be able to develop a curriculum and eventually take it online and teach. I also knew that would be the big, pushing the boulder uphill. So back in 2008, 9, unfortunately, when we refined the curriculum with the desire to take it to market was right after the financial meltdown. And so first the United States was, reeling it, and then the rest of the world. So timing was bad, including in 2010, I did a continuing education program in Stanford that was taught it took place in Barcelona, but a lot of it was the context of design thinking and, application of that in environments. And I took the content of this curriculum to share with my professor there and just get feedback to see, what his thoughts were if we had missed the boat, if what we were doing had relevance, if there were others doing it and we were just not aware. And I'll never forget when him looking through it, and then looking at me and going, oh my God, this is so far ahead of market. I just can't believe it. Okay. And, and fast forward, he worked with a couple individuals that he formerly had taught with at Duke, and we were going to together take it to market. So I wanted the academic partnership, even, going back 13 years ago. But then they were given an edict by their campuses because of what was changing because of the financial meltdown. Curriculums change. It happens. It just happened again with the aftermath of pandemic. But the last wave was after the financial meltdown of 2008. Okay. So, great ideas. They all thought bad timing. Okay. So in the meantime, after 2012, I continued to refine components of it, and of course you're learning with each client, exercise yes. iterations. And then in 2017-ish, 2017, actually, we decided that we would kind of twofold, begin to build the brand of living the brand and begin to do large scale events that we would talk about what we were doing with it and begin to form the first cohorts and training, etc. And in addition to that, we would those that we invited to be speakers and part of our events would be, and I'll say, I personally did all the research on the speakers and the outreach because I wanted truly unique organizations, whether they were enterprise or funded startups, privately held, that understood and lived the whole concept of living the brand, or had embarked on some challenge and overcome it and could tell the story of how, or funded startups that were disrupting industries. So by industry and sector, we were learning, how those would change and what would necessitate the changes to their brand strategy. And then COVID hit. So the positive in that is that, the third phase of our build out was the digital, which we're working on right now. Which had I not decided to start a PhD, we'd already be in market with much of it. But I had decided to start the PhD before COVID hit. So I started in early 2019 and was in classes and program, it was a weekend classes, for an entire, I think, year and maybe 3 months before COVID hit. But then, then twofold, we had the pandemic going on and COVID, the pandemic going on and my studies. So, again, we've further refined what we're doing and we have, basically master classes in brand strategy, brand image, brand implementation, specific targeted areas. and much of that will begin to take online here yet in 2023. So that's kind of where we're at with Living the Brand Academy. It's a long-term, we know it's a long-term strategy, but we also think that it is as relevant today as it was when we, began the process. And like, I guess like Baba Shiv from Stanford told me, it was way ahead of market then. Sometimes people, organizations aren't ready to buy what's way ahead of market. They're just not. So now they're ready.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
But don't you think that the pandemic kind of changed that a lot? Because a lot of companies, they were not ready for that. They didn't know that was going to happen. The pandemic just boom, just like that. It's like everything needs to switch from being in person to online. And I think that's one of the reasons that make Amazon go so up, because before the pandemic, not a lot of people know Amazon exists. So when the pandemic hit, companies like Amazon went up because everything is open of your door. So I think that I felt like with the pandemic, they will need your help a lot more because they need to change the brand around. They need to think differently and they need to make changes and they need to make it fast to stay in the market.
Right. Yes. The pandemic. Well, and also, what happens in crisis is a lot of innovation that needed to happen anyhow. But in crisis mode, my research in my dissertation was eye-opening there with regards to, what happens under crisis in environments that, either of innovation or that where innovation was needed, but was slow going. And you can see a lot of innovation happens at scale during crisis.
Yes.
Because of the necessity. It kind of makes you go like, why does it take us to be in crisis mode to get a fire under us? But humans.
Yeah. Stubborn. We don't want to change sometimes.
Yeah.
It's working. Why change it if it's working?
Exactly. Fear, risk. Yeah.
We think about it all, and after that, we're like, we're not taking that risk. It's too much work.
Right.
We need more staff members. We need more this, more that. Oh, that's scary. We don't want to go there at all.
Right.
So I think that's one of them. But when we talk about living the brand, so can anyone go to the website and take the courses? How does that work exactly?
Right now you can't because they're not online. You would have to sign up for a cohort or a specific workshop. But that, if you went and looked at the site now, you wouldn't be able to access any of it because we're in the process of the next phase of the build out. And so right now, what you'll see out there is the access to the events that took place and such before COVID, and some workshops and such, but not the next in-person or online classes because we're preparing to launch all that. Hopefully by the end of summer.
It's coming.
Yeah, it's coming. Long time coming.
But it's worth it, though. It's worth it because I think that a lot of people will be able to benefit from it as well because even small businesses will be able to have access to it and then learn from it, right?
Yeah. And the market's ready now, they're ready and everyone knows how to use the tools. Before, if we tried to do some of this online, we knew the challenge would be teaching people to use the tools when they didn't want to use them. Especially those that are like beyond 40, but have some of the jobs that are, well, now everybody's there. Everyone's online. Everyone is learning in that manner. Everyone's used to being on Zoom and, all the platforms, the platforms Microsoft offers and others, whatever their, platform of choice is, but they're used to it. And, and they're used to collaborating in those environments and doing workshops in those environments and doing breakouts with, combined teams. So now you're bringing something to market that the market's ready for, not trying to push a market. Okay.
To get ready for it.
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you, pandemic.
Yeah. There are always the positive you can find in the silver lining, right?
So now, is it going to be live and also pre-recorded videos? How does the system is going to work?
Yep. There will still be live workshops and trainings, but there also will be hybrid, and there will be completely online.
Completely online.
Yes.
So now you have lectures for the past 20 years on branding, design, innovation, organizational change, and also development and leadership development. What is your approach to teaching, and how do you ensure your courses are relevant and effective?
Are what?
How do you make sure that your courses are effective?
Effective?
Yes.
Like any, the delivery of any product or service, you need to gauge from customer feedback, and the customer in the instance of the academic environment, whether it's inside of a college or university or inside of an academy like this, is your student. So you can do that through online surveys, actual interviews, all the way through the process, like continuing to refine what we're doing, getting feedback from those who are using it, is the most valuable tool you can get in most industries. The customer is not afraid to tell you what works and what doesn't if you ask. So that will be important, on an ongoing basis as we try to build and scale what we're doing with it.
Exactly. And you are right about it, because if it's changed their life, they're going to tell you. If it's stink, they will tell you it's stink.
Yep. They're not afraid to tell you.
They're not afraid to tell you. But I think that a lot of people don't take, sometimes they get mad, they get angry of the customers' reviews. And I think that if people really listen to the customers, even the bad reviews, you can find something positive on them.
Right.
On my point of view, because we are not all perfect. There's always little changes we can make. Don't get me wrong. Some reviews can just be blah, blah, blah. They don't really have any meanings behind them.
Right. Well, oftentimes, you can learn the most from an opportunity that was a challenge, that something did go wrong, and your reaction and actions taken to resolve it can also create, sort of a raving fan, or somebody who will tell 10 more people about the horrible experience. It's how you as the organization or the service provider save yourself and bring value to the customer. If your team did in fact fall down, how do you make it right? How do you right it? Now, there are also, equally as many customers that have unrealistic, even if, the contract said this and you deliver that, but I'll give you an example. A significant program that we did for an academic organization, and what we helped put together, provided all the tools, resources, branding strategy, approach for them, including we did all the list building, lead gen resources, but they had to do the work. But they thought we were just going to bring them the leads. Okay. That's not our job. I mean, in some instances, if you want us to hire an outside call service, and further the lead gen, but it wasn't part of this. It was not part of the proposal. It was not part of the, that's where sometimes it's in that instance, you can't educate the client on what they don't know.
No.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
And, there's a lot of lead gen and truly sales and closing of sales. I can't tell you an organization out there that says they're great at it. They love it. It's always where there is always challenges. There's always opportunities too. It's how you're approaching it. And traditionally environments of higher education aren't necessarily used to customer acquisition. So this was a unique situation where because what they're bringing to market is very new and different, and the collaborations that need to happen are new and different, they have to become a good at customer acquisition. And the customer, in many instances, is also their partner. So everyone's learning and growing together. And collaborations and partnerships, those are going to continue to change in every industry like we've never seen before in the next 5 to 10 years, significantly. And AI is just going to explode that even more.
The world is changing. I can tell you that from the time I was born to now, that's a huge difference between them two. So now you have a PhD in values-driven leadership. Can you tell us about your research and how it has influenced your approach to leadership and business strategy?
Sure. So I just defended my dissertation in November of 2022. And my specific research was focused on the links between purpose and innovation in organizations. And part of why, you'll see a theme running through the companies and, my choices strategically from an education standpoint as well. Part of why I decided to do this program was because I felt like leadership teams are challenged in ways the world hasn't seen before. And that was prevalent before COVID. COVID just exacerbated it. And leadership teams, many people think of leadership as the boss, but leadership is much more than managing people. And providing leadership is a much broader need, and having good leaders that are capable of operating, in volatile and, with what's called the military cone, the term VUCA environment, voluntary, uncertain. I can't remember the C and the A, but that are many environments today. And now add the component of remote workers, hybrid workers, etc. And it's a continual challenge in all environments. And so to me, I wanted to learn more about the organizational behavior and organizational development components of that, so that I could help teams help themselves in more beneficial ways, with more tools and access and other resources, including people, because I've certainly, I have a enormous network nationally and globally, but the process of getting this involved in academia has exposed me to a lot of scholars globally, and other PhDs doing similar type of research. So, and my choice of my dissertation topic, goes back to the continued work that we do and what I would see in environments when culture, when there was good understanding of not just the organizational purpose, but what each individual's purpose was in achievement of that organizational purpose, therefore giving them more strength in their own individual meaning and depth in how they apply themselves and their strengths to serving the bigger purpose of the organization and or of society. And I also saw, because often we are working in fast changing environments or environments of innovation. And that's, partly because the nature of me, I've always pursued, or, we've often got, recently somebody mentioned to me something called a special teams agency. And I was like, we pretty much have been a special teams agency since inception. And that's when, often we'll get challenges that traditional, like maybe larger agencies wouldn't, but that's because we had built somewhat of a reputation for being able to move promptly, see and look past what others might not challenge, have the courage to be at the table and challenge what's happening. And so looking at, if purpose can be this generative and positive in any environment, what does it do in an environment of innovation when, innovation or change in general is not something that people, the majority of people embrace willingly. Okay. It takes a certain type of individual cut from a certain thread to lean into innovation and be a leader, and there are actual full-blown, titles and people that, oftentimes don't have the large reporting structures to them because that's not where they're best. They're best at challenging the status quo, at looking at where you need, at being somewhat of a futurist, looking at where you need to be 10 years out. So the study is, it's considered a groundbreaking study because I'm the first to have looked at the two constructs in the way that I did against each other. And it's, from a scholarly standpoint, there's like, you're in a great position because of access to organizations. I have 14 global organizations involved, and that includes 5 large publicly traded enterprise companies, 4 highly funded growth companies, from companies with outside funding from 30 million to 300 million, but they're still very much startups, just at different phases, and disrupting, certain areas, medical or SaaS technology, or actually 2 others that involved a global incubator that was funded by the government in New Zealand, NEOM, which is the cognitive city that's being built in Saudi Arabia, and 1 policing organization and 2 military organizations. So a very diverse group of companies and organizations. And that was very purposeful for the point of being able to look at, regardless of the type of environment and industry, what are the common components that happen when purpose is present in environments of innovation. The 2 military environments included some of the innovation taking place as a result of the insurgents at the Capitol January 6th last year, and the logistics for all the armed forces, and the changes in innovation that needs to take place there. So you can see, like, very, but what are the common patterns? And so I built a framework that, essentially comes down to, this will make it sound completely simple, and it is not, but clarity, building clarity. And, that happens, I'm going to grab a document here. That happens by envisioning the change, communicating the vision and the common purpose, supporting the strategic approach, and role modeling. Okay, all of that drives clarity. Okay, that sounds simple, but executing.
Sound like it.
Okay. That there's 5 components that roll up to building confidence in an organization: galvanizing shared goals and common values, providing balance for internal and external stakeholders, supporting an environment or a climate for innovation, motivating collaboration and teamwork, and enhancing meaningful work. Meaning, what I saw in the data from all of these organizations is when those 5 components are present, it enhances the confidence level of the organization working together and the teams working together, the individuals, i.e. translates to the organization itself and or the brand. Mm. And then and leadership fosters it in that component. In the beginning phases, leadership creates it or leads it. Yes. And so the framework that I've built has these 13 components that feed into clarity, confidence, and commitment, because the last one is 4 components that feed the commitment is leadership provides continual and commitment and support, support of a continuous learning environment, motivation of perseverance, resilience, and resolve. When purpose is present, it motivates the resilience in people. It gives them the ability to, it becomes the motivator that if they have to go above and beyond, there's a driver. And last creates a long-term focus versus short-term tactical, sort of spurts. And all 4 of those roll up to enable endurance and commitment. And so, the 3 overriding components of the framework are clarity, confidence, and commitment. And leadership, in the beginning phases helps to create it, in the middle phases helps to foster it, in the last 4 phases demonstrates it continuously. Okay, and in demonstrating, you also have to role model and teach others how to be.
That's the hard part.
Exactly. It sounds easy.
But it's not.
But it's not. And any one component of it can create challenges in environments, especially when, risk is present. And usually when innovation is being pushed somewhere, it's creating changes and people are fighting for budgets and, those who want to see the change, those who don't believe the change needs to happen. So a lot of dynamics.
Listening to you talking, it's like listening to you when you're talking at the beginning about you as a young child, and then listening to you talking now, it's kind of like the same person still exists. It's that little child still inside, and that little child still you. Not in a bad way. In a great way, because a lot of us, when we are kids, we grow up, we change completely. It's like that person completely changed. But it's kind of nice to meet people that all the great component, the things that they have within them as a child, they carry it even as an adult. And that even make them greater, a better, stronger leader. And that's the amazing part about it. Like you said at the beginning, as a kid, you're that person that just as people want in that table. As a young adult, they want you in that table. They want you there because you can bring something they don't have. And you are still that as an adult. You are still that person people will want to bring because you think outside the box. You don't think like everyone else. Like you are very detailing, which is awesome.
I appreciate that. Yeah, oftentimes, some of the exercises, there's something called appreciative inquiry that we learned a great deal about, more about in the PhD program that, is kind of a style of interviewing and bringing in data from audiences, where you are appreciating their strengths versus focusing on weaknesses. And, it's very generative and positive. And oftentimes by asking individuals to reflect on times in their life when, think back to their childhood and the things that made them happy. And they begin to see patterns. Well, yeah, I mean, if you asked me at 25 to explain all of this, no, because you don't have the experience, it's like it's happening. You don't even know it's happening. I mean, you're just living and making a paycheck and, figuring out what you're going to do next. But, at this point in my life, I've had time to be reflective and look at the patterns and learn from them. And we were very, very early adopters of Gallup's Strength Finders. I don't know if you're familiar with that, through the Gallup organization. Okay. That is profound. Okay. We started using that in the mid 2000s. It didn't have much traction at all, but now even the big four consulting houses, it's proliferated, and it's, a very strong tool because people have learned and environments have learned and HR departments have learned that you can, you'll never make someone's weakness a strength. You may improve it, but there's much more value and less cost in improving and scaling people's strengths and shoring up the gap with somebody who has a strength where they don't,
Yes.
So we used it as a small team to look at in hiring. We would have people do there's a free component you can have. So we always bought, like 15 of the books. And when we did a recruiting for somebody, we would have people take there's a free version that comes with I can't remember the first book by Marcus Buckingham. But it has a code in it. And that the free one is pretty telling. And it could also give you an opportunity to look at, their strengths versus the rest of the team. Did they bring strengths where there were gaps somewhere? And I think teams are continually getting better and better. And I think as we continue to go forward with, all of the digital and AI tools, this is going to continue. There's going to be learning matrix, that happen within organizations that, that they can put up a big screen and you can look at, what areas do you have strengths and where are your gaps, and what training modules do we have, or do we need to outsource to get you development in those areas? It's going to, that is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years, the growth of those areas is going to be profound.
Absolutely. And I agree with you on that too. But I would love to, oh my goodness. I love talking to you. I guess that's what I wanted to say. You have a lot of the way you see branding, the way you see strategic, the way you see things in a different way that when I speak with other people, and I think that's one of the key things with everything that you do within your company. And that's the reason why you work a lot with bigger companies compared to smaller companies, because even if we need it, sometimes we don't see the value until we reach a certain level when we within our company itself. But now, before I let you go today, how can someone reach out to you for your support?
Well, the best way is probably email. And my email is patty@CREATV as in Victor, LOGIC.com. I do also have an email, the same patty@livingthebrandacademy.com. I haven't used that one as much. The Creative Logic is 25 plus years old. Although I get a lot of spam, but I have killer filters. But at this point, it's funny when you have an email for that long, how much you get hit by
spam.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I would welcome any outreach. Also, our websites are online. The same URL, www.createvlogic.com and www.livingthebrandacademy.com.
Well, thank you so much, Patty, for sharing your knowledge, your insight with us, and then for all the great work you are doing. Like, being you, the real thing. And I like that. And I like talking with people that just speak their mind and then say it how it is. I know sometimes it's the hard thing to do, but it's a lot of time, it's the right thing to do, because we need to hear it to make a change in this world. And we need more people like you to just say it. Hey, this is not going to work. We need to go that path instead. Instead of just making us believe that we're in the right path when we are not in the right path.
Right. Yeah.
So I appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate yours as well. And I appreciate the good work that you're doing.
Thank you for listening to Female Founders Podcast. That's it for this week's episode. Be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app or connect with us on womel.com so that you don't miss our next episode. See you next time. Bye for now.